A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
I feel like we've been talking about preparing for challenging times for a little while now, but it looks like challenging times might be here. They might be on your doorstep. It could be crunch time today. For mortgage holders, the Reserve Bank Board has been meeting. They'll be announcing their latest deliberations on interest rates. Most commentators agreeing they're likely to stay on hold at 4.35%. But there are some economists who are forecasting the possibility there could be another rate rise before the end of the year. But you may know that investment markets have been going through a major correction, and there are rough conditions on the horizon. Well, Alex Cook is back with us today. Alex, a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner, and he's the founder of Wealth with Purpose. His ministry is to help equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills. And shortly we'll open our talkback lines for your opportunity to ask whatever question you'd like on 1800 316 316. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back.
Alex, let's start with the major corrections that are going on right now in global investment markets. Sharp falls in this past few days. What's been happening?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch. The big one being, and most notable, has been Japan. Now, Japan is extremely relevant to the world since it's the third biggest economy on the planet. It's also the most indebted nation of all the wealthy countries, but their stock market has basically crashed. I don't use that word very often, but it's fallen 25% over the last 2 weeks, and most of that has been in the last 3 days, including yesterday, where it was down 14% in a single day, which was the biggest point fall in its history. So fascinating. Other countries haven't been immune. Taiwan and other Asian countries, some of them seeing the biggest drops they've experienced in 60 years. The US market, which is probably the most relevant, because what people might not realise is the US stock markets make up roughly 50% of the world's stock market capitalisation, as we call it, the value, if you like, and they've fallen about 10%. And the Aussie market hasn't fared too badly, all things considered. It's down about 7%. So it's been some dramatic falls. But the other area that people often ignore, because they look at the stock market, that's the one that makes the headlines, but it's actually the bond market where a lot of the action is happening, because the bond market has reacted also very dramatically with big falls in what we call the bond yield. And basically what that is doing is it's predicting interest rates cuts. So, for example, the Australian 10-year bond has, the yields are plummeted, and so it's essentially forecasting 75 basis points or 0.75%, if you like, point in rate cuts. Not necessarily today, by the way, but that's just what it's factoring in going forward. So there's a lot of drama in markets at the moment, and it's will be interesting to see if it continues, if it's part of a bigger trend, or whether we get a bit of a bounce back from here.
Well, a week might be a long time in deliberations for like our RBA, because, yes, it's only in these past few days or a week ago, people were predicting the possibility of a rate hike going up before the end of the year. But this makes a big difference, do you think, in thinking? And maybe the RBA, while they may leave things on hold today, may actually be thinking of when they might need to do emergency cuts if things get worse?
Yeah, I certainly think they'll be thinking that way. I'd be inclined to think they stay on hold today. Australia's got a bit of a unique problem in that the inflation figures that came out last week are still very high. They're 3.9% compared to other countries where it's starting to come down lower, like in the US. Most countries still haven't quite got where to they want it. So typically, for example, Australia likes to get inflation to between 2 and 3%. So we've still got quite a long way to go. And that's why I think they'd be very hesitant to cut. But equally, with these dramatic falls on markets, the reason why markets are falling, particularly say in the US, is that recession has become far more likely. So, for example, last week in the US, the unemployment figures came out, and they were much, they were still positive, but they were lower than expected in terms of the number of new jobs that have been created. And that sent the markets into somewhat of a tailspin. And therefore, the prediction now, if you think going forward, is that central banks are going to have to start to lower rates, which is actually starting to happen in some economies anyway, but they're going to have to do that in order to try and create a soft landing, as they call it, in the economy. So it's going to be an interesting couple of months, especially obviously with US elections and all these other things looming. There's a lot going on out in the world at the moment.
Alex, there may be something of an elephant in the room. Just let me broach this early, and listeners might like to follow through with your own feelings here. But doomsayers and fearmongers, watch YouTube, and it doesn't matter how long, you'll find somebody who's a doomsayer, a fearmonger, saying what's coming is worse than any recession you can ever remember, and the resistance, I guess, that you need to have not to be reactionary or fearful. I wonder whether you've got any thought here, or are those doomsayers and fearmongers actually they're onto something?
Look, there's always been a certain percentage of the market that are those doomsayers, etc. And look, I think the reality is at some point you're right. If you look at the economic cycle, or the economic clock as they call it, if you keep predicting doom, eventually you'll be right one day. You might be 10 years before you're right, but eventually you'll be right. But look, with those things, I try not to pay too much attention, because they can suck you in and lead you to making very bad decisions that are harmful to your wealth. For example, if you listen to all those things, you may find yourself never investing at all because you're worried that the whole world's going to cave in. So to me, as a Christian, you need to be discerning, and you need to look at the facts as they are and try and be as objective as possible, and get multiple opinions. Don't just rely on one. But I do think, where I think the doomsayers, maybe they're onto something, and this is really, I think, the spiritual side, Neil, of what's going on, is, I watched, as many people did, I watched the Olympic Games opening ceremony, and you saw this degradation of Western culture live. And we're seeing all these sorts of things. We're seeing a massive spike in civil unrest. So there's been the riots in the UK. Last week there was the elections in Venezuela where they're all protesting. You've got wars on the increase. And markets up until last week were priced for perfection. In other words, they were very expensive. They were very overvalued. We'd been warning people to be cautious for quite a long time. Because everything looked very stretched and priced for only good news. But now there seems to me a convergence of events going on around the world, whether it's war, whether it's, as I say, the social degradation we're witnessing, the civil unrest, and of course then you've got the explosion in technology, like AI, for example. So all of these things come together and they do make you wonder how it's going to play out. And so I think as a Christian, the important thing is to be prepared, but be prepared spiritually, be prepared practically, and not fear, and learn to, seasons like this are a time where you learn to trust in God and realise that at the end of the day, He's the one who's in control, and we've just got to do our bit.
And let's not get too theological, although we're not afraid to talk about biblical principles in money on a program like this today. But you've raised something very important, Alex, and there might be listeners who'll like to contribute here, but a spiritual issue involved, what it is to have a heart after God. Because if you allow or are exposed to the moral decay, as you're describing, and linking moral decay with the potential for economic chaos. And sometimes we don't link our money with a sinfulness, but those two, they could be connected too, biblically speaking.
100%. Take the issue of debt. You ultimately, the Bible uses this wonderful, farming concept of reaping what you sow, right? And so when we think about the level of debt in the world at the moment, both government debt and household debt is basically at record levels. Australia, and I've been warning your listeners, Neil, for years about Australia being the second most indebted households on earth. But when you ask yourself, why is that debt there in the first place? Yes, some of it is very practical in the sense people just want to own their own home and get ahead, absolutely. But then there's a lot of it that's also there just through the natural materialistic nature of our society, whether it's expensive holidays, expensive cars, and so forth. So the reality is, though, when debt gets this out of control, eventually a bill comes due. And I think that's what we're starting to see. Now, just to give listeners an idea of the United States here, it's got 35 trillion in debt, but it's currently racking up debt at the moment at $74,000 per second. $74,000 per second. Its interest bill is $2 billion a day. A day. That's their interest bill. So eventually, something has to go wrong. And I think, and this is where, once again, the doomsayers, maybe they're onto something, is at some point these things need to stop. And I think we are probably getting closer and closer to that. Does it happen the next 3 months or the next 3 years is anybody's guess. But certainly, history would say that governments do not have a good record of repaying their debts. And as I say, the Bible warns us, you will reap what you sow. And if you borrow too much money and you can't repay it, there will be a consequence for that. And that's what we need to be well aware of, and why you and I, Neil, have been talking for years, trying to encourage people to reduce their debt loads. Don't buy into this Western culture of you have to have it all now. It's very dangerous, and that's what we're starting to see.
Let's come back to what's happening internationally. There appears to be a perfect storm that might have led to what's happened with this chaos on markets at the moment. Wondering here how things that are developing around the world might influence the way we think about our own investment strategies that we might have, so far as putting money away for this or for that, or for investing in, whether it's the property market or the stock market. How does this storm of chaos affect us personally?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I mean, the obvious thing is that we are, it would appear very likely we're going to go into recession. It seems to be the case in most countries. And you've got these rising geopolitical tensions that we're witnessing everywhere. So in terms of how do we prepare? Well, this is where I love the Bible, Neil, because it gives us so much great wisdom. Firstly, there's a wonderful passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 2, which talks about, it says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. So it's essentially saying, don't have all your eggs in one basket. So for listeners, many people have superannuation funds, investment portfolios, all of those kind of things. It's very important to make sure you're adequately diversified, because we don't know how things will play out. We don't know how governments will respond, because that's a big impact on the way things will play out, the way governments respond, and so forth. And it all affects us differently. And this stage of life you're at will have a big impact. If you're young, you shouldn't be worried too much about your superannuation and your investments, because you've got plenty of time for them to bounce back if we do get, a major economic downturn. Whereas if you're, say, 65, you're on the verge of retirement, now might be the time to really think, well, I need to be a bit more careful. I need to make sure I manage this money well. Yes, I need to beat inflation over the long term, which is a big one. But the reality is I also need to protect the capital, because, if I retire and then I'm not going to go back to work ever again, I can't afford to lose a huge amount of that capital. I've got to manage it well. And so it's really learning, I think, at this time, understanding how markets work, and preparing yourself accordingly with an appropriate amount of risk for your particular situation and for your particular age and stage of life. I think they're some of the big ones. But very important to people, try and maintain a long-term perspective. Try desperately not to get caught up in the short-term noise and what you're seeing on TV. It's all very, dramatic. And the reality is these things, these are storms. They're normal parts of the financial markets and how they operate. It's not unusual what we're witnessing at the moment.
Alex, let me ask you, because when we talk about the difference between those who are doing well, those who've paid off their house and they've got a few dollars set aside, and they're not really doing it tough at all. But this gap between the wealthy and the poor, and even the thought that there is a new poor poverty class coming into even our Australian society, is concerning for so many. What are your thoughts around concerns about growing sort of an inequality even in Australian society?
Look, it's becoming increasingly serious, because what we're witnessing in the West in general, not just Australia, is the slow, if not increasingly rapid, decline in the middle class. But it's affecting people in different ways. And it's fascinating to watch because we are seeing this inequality. Now, just to comment on inequality in and of itself is not a problem, so long as you don't have wide gaps. Now, what we're starting to see is the gap is widening. It doesn't bother me that someone's wealthier than me. What would bother me, though, is if I'm really struggling to put food on my table to pay my bills, right? So that's when that inequality starts to become a real problem. And we're seeing it in two major ways. So the first is between the young and the elderly. Young people have just witnessed mortgage rents have gone up 50% over the last 4 years. Mortgage repayments have gone up even more than that. Whereas those who are, say, the baby boomers and those older than the baby boomers are basically finding that they're doing really well. Their assets have all gone up, their share portfolios, their houses. If they're debt-free, then they're doing really well. And it's actually starting to play out very distinctly in the numbers. So, for example, the older generations, they've increased their spending by 14% over the last 12 months. The younger generations have only increased it by 3%. Which in real terms, like when you allow for inflation, is actually negative for the younger generations. So you see that generational gap by age. That's the first one. And then the second one is between those who are debt-free and those who have mortgages. And once again, it's the same trend. Those who have mortgages, their spending is very, very constrained, whereas those who are debt-free are increasing their spending. So it's a massive increase, massive change. And so, for example, at the moment, Lamborghini sales have hit record highs in the last couple of weeks. Spending on cruises, which is mostly older people, there are lots more families doing it these days, but overall, it's at the older generation. They're up 22% year on year. And the one that surprised me is Flight Centre announced the other day that business class sales are up 98%. So what we're starting to see is this sort of two-tiered society now, as I say, and part of it's generational and part of it's those who are trapped in the debt cycle and the rent cycle and those that are completely set free from that. So it's becoming very, very distinct and obvious. And I think that is not good for its social cohesion, especially in a society like Australia that's been such a, relaxed society for a long time. I think we are going to become a more angry society, unfortunately.
And, a lot of people, when they feel the frustration of the gap that's growing between rich and poor, and as you say, perhaps even a disappearance of a middle class, well, people are looking to our governments for some level of solution here. What do you think, when so far as a downturn like we're now experiencing, people who are concerned and frustrated and they have anxiety about this gap that's rising, you've got some who are doing well and some who are not doing well at all looking to the government for some sort of answer to their own challenge. Where do you think a government response might be in a downturn like this?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think just to comment, one of the things that concerns me about the Australian mentality is whenever something happens, we say, government, please help me, please solve the problem. And to me, that's not a sign of a healthy society. Where I think we as believers have a massive opportunity, it should be, say, as Christians, we should say, what is it that we as Christians are going to do to solve society's problems? Do not rely on the government is a very strong message. And to me, I'd say to Christians, churches, you name it, it's up to us to step up to the plate and solve problems. That's what we're called to do as part of, redeeming our culture and sharing, obviously, the good news, which will help change the culture and bring about good outcomes anyway. So that's the first comment, is the mentality, I think, in Australia is very problematic. It's far, far too dependent on government. But what will government do during this? Well, I think there's a couple of things. Governments fear losing power during downturns, and that's why they are more than likely going to step in with more extreme measures. I mean, what we saw during COVID, where they pumped $300 billion into the economy, was mind-boggling in terms of the sheer amount. And of course, it's then led through to inflation. But I think what we'll see is more command and control over the economy, as in they're going to be more interventionist, which long-term is negative. In the US, both sides have Democrats and Republicans have said they want to do more protectionist policies, which I think is a mistake. But the other big trend, and this is what I think you're going to hear a lot more of in the next 12 months, is the central bank digital currencies. They're all being developed by central banks around the world. Russia's just announced their one, the digital ruble, which launches on 1st of September. And that's, I think, the big thing you're going to see in this coming economic downturn. You're going to see governments introduce that. There is also another risk, and this is the one that really upsets me, and I think is the war. Governments during tough times will use it as an excuse to find external enemies. We're seeing that with Russia at the moment and Ukraine. That war is escalating, as are wars in the Middle East at the moment. But with the Russia-Ukraine story, F-16s arrived in Ukraine the other day. And so the whole war is escalating, and that will be very bad for society. But governments are looking for a way out of their crises back home, because they cannot sustain the systems that we've built up. We've built up massive debts. We've got unsustainable pension systems. And so I think war is a big, big risk. And that's something I've been staggered by, the lack of peace that we're seeing come out of Western governments being sought over the whole Ukraine thing. So it's a very interesting time, but you're going to see a lot more intervention. And I think central bank digital currencies will really start to accelerate from probably next year.
Just quickly on the US presidential election, election. You got Donald Trump, Kamala Harris. Usually it would appear to me that, economic conditions, everyone fights to keep everything pretty stable so that you can get through an election, so that there's not a big advantage one way or another. Is there something that might be stabilising in the US economy that might be able to be relied upon, at least until an election?
Certainly, I think they'll do whatever they can to keep the economy as strong as they can over the next couple of months until the election comes by. Particularly the Democrats, who are obviously in power at the moment, they'll want a strong economy. In fact, the front page, I think the Australian today, had a picture of a plane with Joe Biden as the captain and Kamala as the co-pilot, saying, "Can you give us a soft landing, please?" so in other words, they're doing everything they can. They're pulling out every stop to try and keep the economy strong between now and then. I suspect, though, inevitably, early next year, you're going to have a downturn in most Western economies. I think it'll be harder to stop by then.
And I did see that same cartoon, by the way, and the thing that actually gives context to, Kamala saying, "Can we have a soft landing?" And there's Joe Biden saying, "Can we land this thing at all? Because your eyes go out and the plane is disintegrating around them." So yes, that rather is, it's amusing, and sometimes those cartoons speak a lot more to the reality than what we might think. In fact, Alex, why don't we take a call before we move on? Let's hear from Matthew, who is in Brisbane in Queensland. Hey, Matthew, welcome.
G'day, gentlemen. Thank you.
What are your thoughts here, Matthew?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment, and then I've got a quick question for Alex. A lot of what you've been talking about, I sort of try not to go down the rabbit hole with some of the doomsday guys, because a lot of them quote scripture about the one world government and the single world currency and leading up to the mark of the beast and all this kind of stuff. But there was just a couple of points I wanted to make from scripture, and one is that Jesus said when he spoke about the rapture, two will be in a field, one stays, one goes. Two are threshing wheat, one stays, one goes. It'd be like in the days of Noah. They'd be marrying, giving in marriage. Life would be going on. Life would be continuing. The other thing he said to us is to not be troubled. And so I know for myself, God's really been working on my attitude towards finance and really trying not to be too caught up, still being wise. He said, be gentle as doves and wise as serpents. But Alex, where I'm sort of struggling a little bit is trying to find the right attitude towards money and finance, because a bit like Paul, I know what it is to have much, I know what it is to have sort of nothing. And so but I am struggling a little bit, especially with markets and things the way they are, in having just the right attitude towards money to make sure that I'm honouring God and I'm not putting money ahead of God. Does that? Yeah.
Great thoughts,
100%.
Matthew. Let's hear from
Yeah.
Alex.
Well, just listening to you talk, and it sounds like you've gone through a very good thought process about this. Anyway, I would have said you're well and truly on the right track. I mean, I agreed with almost everything you said. We shouldn't be troubled by what's going on. The Bible warns us about these things that they're going to take place. And as you say, rightly, in the days of Noah, things will still be ticking along. It's not like, you listen to some of the doomsayers, it's kind of like civilization's going to end sort of thing. That's not what's going to happen. It will continue. It'll just be, a bit more messy and chaotic than what we're used to. But I think there's two ways to handle this. One is the spiritual side and the other is the practical side. On the practical side, we want to try and best align our finances with God's word as possible. So we've got to get on with things by making sure we're sensible with the way we spend our money, keeping out of debt or reducing our debts to very manageable levels. It's doing all these sort of what I call really sensible, practical things that help you manage through whatever season we're in. So there's that side of it. Then the second side of it, which sounds like you're already quite strong in because you've thought it through the biblical concepts, is walking as close to God as you can through these things. So whatever gets thrown at you, you realize, what, my life here is temporary. One day I'm going to be with Jesus in heaven, and the storms of life when we get to heaven won't have mattered. It's just part of living in a world that's got a mixture of darkness and light together, and there's a real spiritual battle going on that unfortunately we can't avoid. But the closer we walk to God, I think we can have a lot of peace about it. And the other thing I always say to people is get on with whatever God is calling you to do, irrespective of all these things that are going on around us. Because at the end of the day, we can't control it. And the reality is each of us is here with a purpose, and that we've got to live out that calling and fulfill what God has each of us to do, irrespective of the noise and the things that go on. So I actually think you're well on track by listening to you talk. And it's just a case also of making sure what you do with your finances on a daily basis, you'd line God's word as much as you can.
And Matthew, anything further to add to that?
Just, I do appreciate the feedback, because sometimes the simplest encouragements, it's like you get a bit bogged down, and because you sort of start to wonder, am I doing the right thing? One of the other questions I had is there anyone you could recommend as far as teaching goes on stewardship? Because I know stewardship is a huge thing, especially when it comes to finance, because we've got to understand. I'm sort of coming to that understanding that it's not mine, it's God's, and it's God's to begin with, and so I just need to be a steward of it. Is there anyone you can recommend that has some great teaching on stewardship?
Without wanting to push our own boat here, wealthwithpurpose.com is the place to go. So our whole ministry is about helping people learning to be good stewards. In fact, our slogan, if you go to our website, wealthwithpurpose.com, is financial health for a generous life. So we want to help you become financially healthy, become a good steward of what God has entrusted to you, and so that the outworking of that is to be able to live a generous life and advance his kingdom. And we've got truckloads of free resources there. If you go to that, you'll see downloadable ebooks, podcasts, you name it. There's all that sort of stuff there. And that's what our whole purpose is about, is helping people to become good stewards. So check out wealthwithpurpose.com.
Matthew, thank you so much for your call, wealthwithpurpose.com. And if you weren't going to blow your own trumpet there, I was going to jump in and give that website, because I know there's a lot of free resources that are on your website there, wealthwithpurpose.com. Hey, come to some of these issues around the spirituality, just flowing on from where Matthew's at there, because you know what, this is changing attitudes, changing heart, changing thinking around finances, and sometimes we're reluctant to think about changing our thinking because, if we bring God into our finances, maybe we won't be as well off as if we're governed by greed. There's an interesting spirituality around these issues here. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts here about the spirituality and whether people would feel blessed by God financially, or whether they might feel as though somehow or other you're just sort of pushing this whole thing that church often talks about in money. We want your money sort of thing. Any thoughts here around the spirituality?
Yeah, well, look, money is deeply spiritual. And in fact, Matthew, the previous caller, hit the nail on the head when he said, our money is really God's. That's I think the starting point for a Christian is that acknowledgement that everything I have is really on loan from God. I love reading the parable of the gold bags, which is, the master entrusts us with a certain amount, and we all have different amounts, and that ultimately one day we stand before God when the master returns and we've got to give an account for how we've handled it. So that to me means that money is very deeply spiritual. But also it's deeply spiritual because it's the ultimate heart issue. If you look at Western culture particularly, but really any culture for that matter, is that money is one of the main factors that people reject God. They fall in love with money and they chase things of this world, and therefore they don't chase after God, the one who made it all and made it all possible in the first place. And so to me, money is very spiritual because ultimately it has a profound impact on your relationship with God. And that's how we should really think about it. Is money a barrier to my relationship with God, or is it helping me draw closer? And that's why, challenging times like we're in now is actually a wonderful opportunity because it tests us in terms of how we really think and how we really feel about money. It's not until you're under pressure that your faith is tested, and that's what we're going to see with many people in this season. And that's what, and as I say, money is very spiritual, and it's going to be tested.
Let me ask you around issues like when you're trusting God. I mean, come back to what Matthew was sharing. Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me, and of course, in my Father's house are many mansions, and there's a future that is set for the believer. And the thought that if you have this contemplation as a believer, you're saying, okay, I'm going to give all my cares over to the Lord. Cast all my cares upon him. He cares for me. Is complacency then an issue? Because diligence with finance is going to lead to making a profit. Complacency may well lead to poverty. What are your thoughts around being complacent or being diligent in these circumstances when you know you're faced with hard times?
Look, it's a great question, and I think there is certainly that risk. But my view is that as someone gets closer to God, one of the main ways you become closer to God is through spending time in his word. So you spend it in worship, you spend it in prayer, but you also spend it in his word. And when you spend time in God's word, inevitably you're going to pick up the themes on how to live your life and how to be wise, because the Bible is full of those kinds of things, of wisdom on how to live your life and how to use your money. There's 2,350 verses on money, wealth and possession. So more than likely, someone who is actively trying to build their relationship with God and is diligent in reading God's word, and I would argue we should be all doing that as a daily morning routine, that when we do that, the inevitable fruit from that will be wiser living, and therefore probably less likely to have problems with our finances. It's not to say that bad things won't happen, because we live in a fallen world, but you'll be in a far better position to handle challenging seasons if your mindset is built on a biblical worldview, because you faithfully literally feed yourself with God's word. That to me will make a transformative effect in your finances and in your relationship with God.
Let me ask you about the thought you said earlier. Don't be too reactionary. A bit of bad news. It might not be as bad as you think. Then we got onto the thought that maybe those doomsayers, there could be something to what they're saying. And so for people thinking about their finances, Alex, not having a reactionary response, but you can see that in, the major markers, investors who are changing directions and moving their money from one portfolio to another because they see one as safer than another. Any thoughts here around what sort of things you might move to? Somebody said to me a little earlier today when they heard that we were talking about finance on the radio with Alex Cook, someone said, ask him if we should be investing in gold. Is there a way that you can find a safe haven for your money, or are there safe havens for some that might not be so safe for others? Any thoughts here?
Yeah. Look, they're great questions, and look, the ultimate safe haven is God Himself, obviously. Interestingly, when we look at the storms over the last 2 weeks, gold has held up extremely well, and certainly over the last 2 years, we've been positioning our clients with gold because we think it is likely to be a hedge against what I call geopolitical instability. Not so much a hedge against inflation, which is what some of the doomsayers refer to, but to me, it's more a hedge against geopolitical instability. It's also real money, has been around for a long time. Does have its downsides and it doesn't pay any income, but overall, it's a good, stable asset. But coming back to the answer to the question is, where should you put your money? And the answer is, none of us really know how this is all going to play out. It may be impacted by what nation someone's in. Now, in Australia, it's been historically a stable nation, but I do think that its prosperity is on the slide, and therefore things are going to be more challenging. And I think things like gold will probably hold up well. Having cash is important in a downturn because cash will give you opportunities. So if the stock markets do end up falling further, you'll have opportunities and so forth. But the main thing I think is you want to remain flexible. So that way you can adjust to the circumstances because things can move quickly. And also you don't want to be entrapped in debt. One of the things I often get asked, particularly with high house prices, is should I go and buy an investment property? And the one thing that always makes me nervous is when people leverage themselves with huge amounts of debt on the view that property is just going to keep going up forever. And that to me is dangerous in a challenging season. So to me, the main message I'd say is hold a diversity of assets. Don't hold just one thing, and make sure you're as deleveraged as you possibly can be. Have as little debt as you can, because that will make your life a lot easier through the uncertain periods. Because as I say, we don't know how things will play out, and you want to be nimble and you want to be able to take advantage of opportunities if they arise. Don't speculate too.
Okay. Eugene in Perth, and our talkback line open 1800 316 316. Eugene, welcome.
Hi. I've got a question for Alex Cook. Which is the I know that property price in Australia has been going. The asset class is property seems to be a good asset class at the moment compared to shares and cash and bonds. What's your thoughts on that? In that regard, between should I invest in property, shares, bonds, or shares?
Alex.
Yeah, well, look, we can't obviously give investment advice over the air because we don't know someone's situation. So, just to make sure clear here that we can share lots of different opinions and ideas, but we don't want to direct you in any particular direction. My comment on property prices is if you look at a graph of house prices over the last 120 years, and you can get access to these through government websites, housing is currently sitting on, nationally, an average of 13 times income. The long-term average is about 4 times income. So Australian house prices would really need to halve to become attractive again in terms of their value. Now, I'm not suggesting they will halve, but they should halve in order to be good value. The other thing that staggered me when I was looking at it the other day is the average mortgage in Australia has gone from $400,000 per person, this is the average, in 2017, to $636,000 over the last 7 years. So Australians are absolutely up to their eyeballs in debt. So I just can't see the upside in house prices other than through some rate cuts that may come through next year. I can't see much upside to it for the next 10 years because it is so extremely overvalued. Now, people will say, but we're bringing in more people and there's not enough houses. That's all true. But the solution to that is build more houses, and of course reduce the immigration rate so things can stabilise. So I'm not convinced that property is going to be a great place to be in the next 10 years, given the extreme nature of the valuations. And of course, the main issue for anyone buying property is you have to borrow usually a huge amount to get into it. And that to me is the major problem for anyone, especially for young people starting out. It's a major challenge. I think with the season we're heading into, where it's going to be a challenging period, there's going to be lots of wonderful opportunities in probably other asset classes as time goes by. But I would be very cautious in relation to property because I just think it's so extreme in its valuation.
Eugene in Perth, thank you so much for a great contribution. Just touching on this concept of asset classes and such things. Keeping informed about the way that things are moving here, Alex, because if you want to be the person who can take advantage of an opportunity so far as an investment goes, somehow or other you have to keep informed. Is there any way you have got any sort of insight on how do you keep abreast of everything that's going on and recognise an opportunity when it's there?
Look, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one because of the potential vested interest that people hear. Like when you think about daily, what people are listening to through media, a lot of it's driven by vested interest by the kinds of people who are being interviewed and so forth, right? So that presents a challenge. So the way I'd answer it is twofold. One is try and build up a little bit of knowledge, and it doesn't take a lot, on understanding the history of asset classes. So what happens in good times and bad times, so you understand a bit about their history, whether that's shares, whether it's property, whether it's gold, bonds, etc. You need to have a basic understanding of how they work. That's the first part. And then the second part is I would encourage people to follow a couple of different people who are experts in those asset classes. And that way you're going to build the knowledge and but try and get people who are not selling you something. And this is where you have to be really careful. Always ask yourself, how does this person make their money? Do they make something by selling you something? Because that's when you know you're only going to hear one side of the story. And that applies to shares, applies to property. You want to get as independent thinking as possible. And that's where it's hard in Australia because news media is often interviewing people who have vested interest in particular asset classes, whether it's stockbrokers talking about stocks or whether it's, real estate agents talking about property or banks talking about it. So build up the historical knowledge and then listen to experts across the different asset classes so you can continue to build your own personal knowledge.
And Alex, time is running out. Get advice. Time's running out, Alex. So I want to finish in some ways here, not on a negative note. I wonder how we might be able to make sense, mixing faith and biblical foundation insight into the way that the headlines are looking today and the way that people are forecasting tough times ahead. Where do you suggest we help our thinking to be directed in a way that won't send us all crazy?
Yeah, well, so you don't want to fall into the pessimistic trap and becoming inward. To me, this season going forward is going to be a wonderful opportunity for the gospel. It's going to be a chance to strengthen your own personal relationship with God. And the way I think we should be thinking about it is, how can I, as a Christian, be a blessing to others during a challenging period? So in other words, you start having an outward focus rather than an inward focus, because the real risk with all these things is you when you hear bad news, you just kind of want to go into your shell and, forget about life for a while. But we should be doing the opposite. We should be thinking, how as Christians can we go into our society, make a difference in people's lives and be the solution? So that to me is the thinking point, and learning to trust in God to build things the way he would do it. And that's really going to come down to learning what God's word says on, topics about money. So soak yourself in God's word and walk closely with him and be positive about the future. Now, it doesn't have to be positive in the sense of that hyped up positivity in the way that we shouldn't equally be negative. Christians should be people of hope. We should have hope about the future, hope of what God is going to do, and look to what God's going to do and how we can be part of this amazing, tapestry that God is creating. I mean, we've got to think about how we can be part of the amazing things God is doing in the world, because there's lots of good things going on around the world.
Okay, and we're going to wrap up our conversation just coming back to what we mentioned just a little earlier. There are some tremendous resources on the Wealth with Purpose website, and you might actually be astounded when you get onto the website and see the depth and breadth of the number of resources that you are able to access. Things like free ebooks, the My Toolkit, there's videos, there's podcast content, and you'll find those on the Wealth with Purpose website, wealthwithpurpose.com. And that's how you can connect with Alex Cook. Alex is the founder of Wealth with Purpose. You can follow him on Facebook and on Twitter. There's an email you can send, askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com. Alex, great getting your insights as usual, and certainly today a very timely opportunity to be able to talk about these things, because so many people just catching up with the news that there is real turmoil on global markets, and a little bit of confirmation that there could be some tough times ahead, certainly the second part of this year and moving into next year as well. Alex Cook, thanks so much for your insight today on 2020.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.